Many beginners ask me, what should I focus on in order to become a better matte painter? And so I've put together a short list of key elements to matte painting that I think are very important. These parts of matte painting, they typically take years to master, and therefore I would encourage any beginner to start practicing them early on, and that way you'll have more time in your career to explore them. Realistic lighting and exposure and painting in a photographic style, they go hand in hand. Really what we're doing when we create matte paintings is we're creating imagery with painting or with CG or what have you that is really mimicking the look of photography. We're mimicking the look of what a camera sees through a lens. Whether that media be film or digital, there is a look and a style to be copied. Matching the plate is extremely important. When you're given a plate to create a matte painting, what you'll want to do is study at what angles the lighting is coming from and what color is the lighting. The overall perspective of things. Your painting should match the perspective. And color palette is very important. What you want to do is make sure that your color palette, including atmosphere and haze, is very similar in your painting to that in the plate. I'm going to skip to the other side of the list. Strong focal point, good first read, and strong composition all go hand in hand. What I mean by first read is we want the audience, when they see this shot for a short 4 or 6 seconds in a movie, to understand what they should be looking at, immediately look at that, and get the point of your shot before the movie goes on to its next scene or the next sequence. A strong focal point and a strong composition both make a good first read possible. With composition, we want to make sure that our focal point is in somewhere near the center of the scene, not off in the corners. And we want to make sure that we don't have too much activity in the corners of our frame. Overall, it's good to study some of the traditional rules of composition. Camera movement has an effect on a strong composition and a good first read. Therefore, we should be thoughtful when we're animating our camera movement to make sure that we're serving the success of a good first read. We don't want to make camera movement that is too distracting or make it very difficult for the audience to understand what our focal point is. Moving elements are very important in a matte painting, whether it be cars and people, or snow and rain, or simply birds. Incorporating moving elements into your painting can make it feel more realistic in the scope of a feature film. And lastly, we want to make sure that our painting is technically sound. We want to make sure that our perspective is correct. We want to make sure that the scale I've put together a short list of some of the film formats that I've used in my career, and I'll just run through them really briefly. So we have a full app, also known as 4perf. It's called 4perf because there's 4 perforations on the side of the film for the height of the frame, for each frame. This is a typical 35mm film, and a 2K painting, or 2000 pixel wide painting, would fill this frame. To the right we have a couple widescreen ratios, and often what we do is we just matte a black area with a 1.85 aspect ratio or a 2.35 over top of a full app frame. Next we have an anamorphic widescreen format for film, and what this does is it takes a lens and squeezes the image horizontally only when they shoot the movie. And when you project the movie in the movie theater, it uses a C-scope lens to unsqueeze it. On the bottom left-hand side of this slide, I have a high-definition format, and you can compare 1920 by 1080 pixels to the rest of these 2K formats. It's very close in resolution. Typically these are shot with digital cameras, and today they're usually shot with 24p or progressive digital cameras. These next two film formats use very similar film. We just use the area in the frame a little differently. For Academy ratio, there's room for a soundtrack on the left-hand side of the frame. Therefore, it makes the room left for the image a little bit smaller, so we arrive at an 1828 by 1332 format. The next format is Super 35. This format's not quite as popular as the other formats that I've used. The one time that I worked on a Super 35 film, it was hard matted, meaning that we only supplied matte painting and visual effects for the area within the 235 region. The hard matte can change. It can be 185 or whatever the director chooses. Next we have VistaVision or 8perf, with 8 perforations lining the edge of this frame. And we have a nice big frame. When it's scanned at half res, it's 3K by 2K. When it's scanned at full res, it's 6,000 pixels wide. Typically it's a very nice picture when it's projected on film, but it's very rarely used in theaters, especially today. And next we have IMAX. IMAX at 5,600 pixels wide by 4K tall has an extremely clear picture, but creating visual effects for these frames can be time consuming, render times can be very slow, but ultimately it's a very clear picture and a really amazing movie-going experience. Next I'm going to go and discuss the order of events that takes place in order to take a matte painting from concept to a final shot in the feature film. Each one of these steps is in approximate order, but for every shot the process changes slightly. So go ahead and sit back and relax. Take a look at the development of this concept art that took me about 3 hours. It's sped up a great deal, so I hope you can get the general idea of how I work while you listen to my lecture on matte painting in the film industry. I've been a professional artist now in the film industry for several years. I've had the opportunity of working with a large company and working with a small company. And through my experiences, I've learned that there's a fundamental pipeline at which we take our concept art all the way through to the final art, the final matte shot. So usually what we do is we will start off with the plate preparation. We try to get the motion picture plate scanned in some way or form as soon as possible. Sometimes it's just a quick and dirty scan as a stand-in for the final scans. Sometimes you have the opportunity to have the entire scan at your disposal. And what we'll want to do is we want to examine the plate before we start on the concept art. And if that's possible, it'll give us the opportunity to see whether or not there's a camera move, what types of lighting scenario we have to match, and all types of things regarding perspective. And overall, it's ideal if you can get that plate. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you simply ask to create concept art based on some ideas, and later on the plate photography will be shot with the concept art in mind. Now, I've done concept art of all types of styles, and the styles range from a photorealistic style, one that almost looks as complete as the final matte painting itself, and the other end of the spectrum is a very painterly, very sketchy looking concept. Personally, I prefer the sketchy looking concept because what that does is it gives us a little bit more freedom when it comes to completing the final piece of art. This way it seems nothing is really set in stone too early. It's my belief that if we set our concept and we make it too rigid too early, then it limits the room for improvement throughout the remaining process in creating the final matte painting. Also, we'll find that creating the concept in a nice, quick, painterly fashion is indeed a lot faster, and therefore we can turn around maybe 3 or 4 concept paintings as opposed to one highly polished and very photorealistic concept painting. This often gives directors and supervisors numerous number of paintings to choose from, and as a result, typically we explore more, and I find that people generally end up more satisfied with the product that we're creating when we do things this way. Now, the director is usually the person who has the final say on approving. Also ensures that we're going down the right road in creating the final output. I found that in the past when we've had delayed director approvals and we've gone in on assumptions and traveled down that road to creating the final artwork, that sometimes ultimately when the director does see the artwork, there's many changes to be made, and therefore it seems that it's likely that some time had been wasted as a result. However, directors are very busy people, and the supervisors of visual effects crews are often very busy as well, and so it's, in the ideal environment you get director feedback, but sometimes it's just not possible. Sometimes you do have to go on those assumptions simply because directors are still shooting the movie, or they're off in another state or country, and it's just difficult to get a hold of them sometimes because of their schedule. Mapped environment or projection map environment, we would start getting into an animatic with our 3D software. If we're going to just have a 2D camera push-in that we might be simulating within our composite software, then we dive into our composite software, break out a few layers out of our Photoshop document, and start mimicking a rough camera move within our composite software like Shake or After Effects or what have you. Now, if your camera moves are very subtle, you may not have to get into the animatics at all. I've done many shots where I've gone straight from my concept art, jumped ahead to my final matte painting. Understand the technique and certainly be able to implement that in an animatic form if you choose. I detail the techniques of creating camera mapping environments and 3D matte paintings on my second DVD. So if that interests you, I would encourage you to check that out. Now, the details of creating a high-res matte painting, they're covered in a lot of detail here in the next few lectures. Typically what we'll do is we will use a lot of photographic reference as much as possible. What that allows us to do is create a photorealistic scene very quickly and efficiently. And in the film industry, as with most businesses, time is of the essence. And so, since photorealism is our goal, we do often try to use a lot of photographs, often shot specifically for the matte painting. high-resolution images for our matte paintings, but often what we'll have is we also have the production shoot photographs for us. This is commonplace just because sometimes the production is in another country, and there's specific locales that they want to integrate into the matte paintings. You'll also see here in the next few lectures that we like to use CG models with textures and lighting. Often we'll use this technique for creating architecture and very hard-edged surfaces, especially when architecture has some complex lighting or a lot of complex geometry in it. It's great to go in and create a model such as this palace, and with that model we can achieve a lot of very accurate detail if we have the time. And I guess the third thing that we tend to use is quite obvious in creating our final matte painting, and that is simply painting with digital brush strokes. Not only do we use photographic reference and CG for our matte paintings, but often very much of our matte paintings have our own hand-painted brush strokes over top of elements or entirely creating elements. So never underestimate the ability of a matte artist. I believe a matte artist should always be able to go in and detail their matte paintings with hand painting details, and doing it correctly takes some practice and getting familiar with the resolutions needed to achieve photorealistic effects within programs like Photoshop, and having your ultimate product look photorealistic on the big screen. It does take some time, but once you get familiar with that type of process, then it really frees you. That will be fed into the larger master comp done that actually renders out the final shot. What exactly a pre-comp means is it is a small part of the entire scene that needs some movement, and what we will do is we will take a small comp and we will create that movement, do whatever we need with CG or whatever comp tricks we have, render that out, and then that small movie will later be composited into the bigger, larger comp. The bigger, larger comp being the final comp, the one that outputs the final shot to the final movie that everybody sees in the theaters. Your pre-comp might be elements such as a little bit of movement in your clouds, or a section of clouds, or a grouping of waterfalls. Any smaller group of elements that you might want to finesse on a microscopic level before moving on to the larger, more complex level working within a large comp. Now, moving on to the final composite, personally I've had the opportunity to learn from a few really great compositors and work closely with them, and as a result the things that I've learned I've been able to implement, and ultimately I really enjoy it when I have the opportunity to create the final composite for my shot. I typically don't get into very esoteric details such as removing blue screen or green screen from close-up foreground characters and getting into the details of how to extract fine details like hair and stuff like that. But as matte artists, I do believe it's really important for us to get into compositing and understand how we can impact the final look of our shots. And really overall, when that opportunity arises, sometimes when it comes down to a time crunch near the end of a really busy schedule, compositors are often very, very busy. So if you can help out by compositing your own shot, you'll benefit because you also have a lot of control over the final look of your shot. And really, ultimately, I find it very, very much fun and very satisfying. I also want to stress the importance of being able to take your shot from a concept art all the way to final composite. You can make the completion of a shot very, very efficient when you have the insight of a compositor and a matte painter all in one. You can use the tricks of a matte painter and get certain things done early on, or you can use the tricks of a compositor and plan for that. Save some time in your matte painting because you'll know that you're just going to trick it out in your composite. All of these types of things come together in the end and really ultimately save time and save money. Now, one of the last steps that we do in matte painting is we create wedges. And a wedge is basically a film output. A film output that is bracketed, much like you might when you shoot photography. We're going to output certain parts of our matte painting, the entire matte painting, with varying degrees of contrast, brightness, different color, subtle color variances. And that way when it comes back on film, we can make wedge picks and ultimately choose the best looking shot. Usually the wedging process only takes place with a few of the frames in the shot, not the entire shot. Film output is expensive. But once we have some wedge picks, we'll send them off to the director sometimes, and the director can make final wedge picks. And if not, we'll make the final wedge picks ourselves, create the final film out, and send it off to the director in hopes of final approval. So, of course, once the director sees your final shot, if they like it, they will approve it, and the editor will cut it into the final feature film. I just want to take this opportunity to spend a few minutes on these two photographs here to show you some of my typical techniques for image manipulation. Since I brushed through this really quickly on the actual matte painting itself, I want to make sure that there's a fundamental understanding of what I'm doing. Now I've gone and created a hue saturation adjustment layer. I'm going to start by changing the hue and saturation, and you can see that it affects everything. Often I keep the mask completely white so that I can see the overall changes, even though I might want to only change the hue or the saturation of a particular region, like the water, let's say. Now I've gone and inverted my mask to black. Now that hue saturation curve is not affecting anything on my particular photograph. If I choose a brush, now with some white paint, I can paint in that mask, and I can tell it where I want that hue saturation change to occur. So you'll see me do this over and over again. Typically what I do is I let my mask affect the entire image, and then I'll come back and I'll mask that particular area. It's nice and easy to see what you're affecting at that point in time, and you can see the overall changes. Later on you can come back and edit the mask if there's any mistakes. And as well, later on you can bring that selection back by Control, clicking on the mask in that layer. And you can go in and turn that layer on and off at any point in time and see your correction. And as well, at any point in your process, you can go in and edit this particular adjustment layer. with minimal amount of work. Of that mountain in the distance. I'm going to add a curve adjustment layer and start off by showing you how to use the RGB. If you left click on any part of the image, it'll show you where that part is on the curve. If it's a mid-tone, it'll end up in the middle of the curve of that straight line. If it's a bright tone, it'll be in the top right, and if it's dark, it'll end up in the bottom left, sorry. So what you can do is you can click on that point, click on a point on the line. You can lock places off. You can choose, in this case I'm going to choose a value here in the mountain. And if I find that on the curve, what I can do is I can go and push and pull it up or down, make it brighter or darker. You can also use the arrow keys on your keyboard to nudge it up or left or right or down 1 pixel at a time. You'll also notice that I've used points on the curve to lock off values and not change them. This reduces the need to actually have to create a mask of the mountain. And as you make adjustments, mainly the mountain changes. Some of the other parts of the image change a very little bit, but usually you can get away with this. Now, if we change our channel to red, if we pull the middle up, we're going to add red. And if we pull it down, we're going to take red away. Get yellow. Okay, so now let's go into the red channel. Let's just say we want to tweak the color of this kind of cyan, kind of blue mountain. I'm going to find where my values are on the curve, find a couple values to lock off because I don't want them changed. Oftentimes it's good to just scan around the image, find other colors that you want to lock off. Then you can go about changing the amount of red or cyan that that particular mountain has, again without the time-consuming task of creating a mask. Turning it on and off, you can see the change, primarily on the mountain. And this is a technique I use quite often, especially if I can get away with not creating a mask. Now let's go over to this other image. Using curves, you can also add different lighting effects or emphasize shadows and shading on your terrains or your matte paintings. So I'm just going to find where my values sit on my curve, and I'm going to turn it far down into the dark. Now I'm going to invert that mask so it has no effect. Turning it black and white turns on and off the effect that that curve has. Now with the nice soft brush, I can go in here and darken particular regions. So let's say, for example, I want it to look like there's cloud shadows on this terrain. I can start brushing in the shapes of my cloud shadows. We can have cloud shadows falling across the plane here. And at any point in time, this is editable because all you have to really do is edit that mask with black, white, or gray. Okay, so once we get to a point where we like the shape of our mask, I'm just going to go back into the curve. And if you alt-click on that black and white mask, it'll show you the mask that you've created. Pull the shadows off so they don't have as much of that warm sunlight color. And maybe what I'll do is I'll take some of the yellow out as well. So I'm going to push the blue up just a tad. And again, with your arrow keys, you can manipulate the curves on a pixel by pixel basis. Now that shadow still seems a little bit contrasty. In the cloud shadow, I picture that we should have a lower contrast value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to bring the high end down. Realistic. Something like a realistic cloud shadow. And you can always toggle that layer on and off. It's always good to see where you've come from and where you're going. Show that to your supervisor or the director. You can also take a look at the mask. Just remember that's always changeable. And let's move on to the next thing.